The Michaela School is presided over by Katherine Birbalsingh, dubbed Britain's strictest headmistress. She's a friend of Michael Gove and is put on a pedestal as an exemplar of how free schools that resulted from Michael Gove's reforms, his project, while working at the Department for Education in the Conservative Cameron government, she is championed as proof that they were an unalloyed good. And she governs the Michaela School, which has one of the lowest levels of white British pupils in any student cohort in the country. She has a very large volume of Muslim students, and so in order to, as she has said, make multiculturalism work, she has put a lot of downward pressure on the diversity, the fractured ethnic and cultural student body, the heterogeneous student body. She has put a lot of downward pressure on it to militantly enforce silence in corridors, strict discipline, secularism, and vegetarianism to ensure that we all eat as a family. And as I said at a speech in the Family Education Trust conference about a fortnight ago that actually followed Birbalsingh's own speech, to a free-thinking, boundary-testing, rambunctious Anglo boy like me, that sounds like hell. And the problem we have is that Katherine Birbalsingh's model of integration, the authoritarian headmistress dictating what is and isn't British values, and the egalitarian liquidation of ethnic and cultural differences to make a culture that supposedly accommodates all and can be adopted by second-generation and third-generation immigrants who are not so inclined to buy into our culture because they don't think it's theirs. This model of forceful integration is being recited as a prescription for the state writ large by the conservative intelligentsia and politicians. This is why anytime something happens in education, the likes of Spectator, Unheard, GB News often go to Katherine Birbalsingh for her advice. And I don't deny that Birbalsingh seems like a nice woman and that her methods get very strong exam results. But that is a few reasons. One, prying the smartphone away from any student is just going to improve their grades, which she does, much to the protesting of parents, but I think that's a good thing. And also, yes, some unruly students do benefit from discipline and higher levels of conformity. However, it is much better to have a spontaneous order, a bottom-up, organic, high-trust, low application of force culture than it is an enforced, top-down, headmistress-style panopticon. And what is being proposed here is, due to mass migration, due to cultural fracturing caused by multiculturalism as a kind of management strategy for migration, the idea is that the former, the spontaneous order of settled English culture, should be replaced with the latter, the militant secularism and ever-watchful state of the Michaela School model. And I think that just sounds like hell on earth. And I'm not pulling this, I'm not scaremongering, I'm not fabricating this trend out of thin air. Kemi Badenoch, at her opening speech at ARC this year in February, she cited the Michaela School's lawsuit, their victory in a lawsuit brought against them by Muslim parents, as an example of the muscular secularism and liberalism required to quash multicultural sectarianism. For context, in 2023, a group of Muslim students began spontaneously praying in Michaela School's playground. They began acting as a kind of Sharia police by telling other students to dress in Islamic garb and observe Ramadan. And Katherine Birbalsingh responded to this by banning all prayer in schools. Now, reminder, we are not a secular country. We are still a Christian country, a fact that someone should probably inform the Anglican Church of, though as a Catholic, we're outnumbering you guys 2-1 among Gen Z. The trend's looking good. As Ash Sarkar once said, we're winning, lads. Anyway, we are not a secular country. We have never been a secular country. Robert Toombs knows this because Danny Kruger, in his speech at the Now in England event, cited Toombs to make the point that England was a Christendom long before it became a kingdom. It was, of course, the Venerable Bede who, in his great work, described all of the tribes and peoples of England to describe them as the English, the Angles. And it was in the first century, the first Archbishop of Canterbury in 597 AD, who sought guidance from Pope Gregory I and was told, preach against consanguinity, prevent first and second cousin marriage. And this is why these little platoons, these sort of nuclearized families, arose in England long before they did in many other nations. This is why, for centuries, it benefited from these breakdowns in clannish in-group loyalty long before the Catholic Church put the formal prohibition in. I think it was in the 13th century. So these family structures informed how the English think about morality. It allows them to universalize it a lot more. It informed the sort of high trust, spontaneous order, low levels of enforced compliance culture that allowed its markets to flourish. It allowed trade to be conducted on the basis of promises that were kept and upheld. A concept, again, that isn't widespread among the rest of the world. Wade Stott did a fantastic video recently on how the global village, the term that Marshall McLuhan came up for, to describe the homogenizing and interconnectivity phenomena that comes from information and communications technology, like the smartphone, social media, the internet. He said it's more like a global shantytown because the moment you interact with another culture like China or India or Nigeria, then you are exposed to their much lower levels of social trust and their much lower prohibitions against dishonesty, which means that, Western Christian countries have their elderly exploited by spam callers and spam email chains. The idea that all of these things aren't particular to England should be nonsensical to Tombs, given he wrote all of this in his book, but then throws out the idea that this is the product of a long and continuous chain of tradition, culture, custom, and family formation that can instead be condensed down to a curriculum and teach within not a generation, but within sort of 5 to 7 years at the Michaela School, can teach thousands of girls wearing hijabs to subordinate their Islamic identity and their ethnic identity to a British civic identity just by reciting Kipling. And also, on that, related to the family formation point, related to the cousin marriage point, because of course we're relitigating that in Parliament at the moment, because over half of Pakistanis in places like Bradford are married to a cousin. And this clannish loyalty, this asabaya, is actually at the root of the grooming gang scandal, because this is the reason why families, clans, networks not only ran the gangs and brothers, cousins, husbands, sons, often all the same thing, participated in the gangs, but also wives, sisters, mothers, and daughters covered for their relatives because they hated their outgroup. This is important to note because family formation, because culture, because ethnic and religious identity have a much greater hold over people and the pupils at the Michaela School than anything they will be taught. And this is actually embodied by the fact they're wearing hijabs in the first place. This is the thing that I think the likes of Tombs don't really understand. They see religion as something which can be compartmentalized and privately observed and have no bearing on the public sphere. Just like someone's unorthodox sexual appetites can be confined purely to the bedroom, and when they step outside the bedroom, it's a magic portal, and it doesn't shape their personality at all and doesn't motivate them to either avoid that topic of conversation in all interactions or destigmatize their various fetishes to make sure they never feel shame in the first place. See pride. It's strange that Tombs doesn't understand this. Instead, he acts as if Islam is one among many religions on a cultural buffet that you can kind of pick and choose at will, rather than a comprehensive and competitive doctrine of the good that is incompatible with the English Christianity and customs, the settled culture of this land, which has been forced to accommodate it at the expense of the law-abiding, tax-paying native host majority who has never wanted this and voted against it at every opportunity. And the hijab itself is not just a visual marker of Islam, it is a visual marker of a wholly incompatible moral system being practiced. And so all of those moral priors, which would require one to buy into British identity, to have an affinity for Kipling, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Churchill, all of those things are not present. So everything that has been learned at the Michaela School could be cast aside like an old coat. And by not present, I mean, you really have to understand the mindset that someone is in to enforce a hijab upon their daughter in primary school, their wife, anyone. The point of a hijab is to say that sexual assault is a woman's fault because if she dresses immodestly, she has provoked sin in a violent and predatory man. He was walking along, just observing the tenets of Islam, minding his own business, until he saw her ankle or her wrist or her hair and became overtaken by a fevered sexual rage. And so it's actually her fault. So she needs to dress modestly at all times so as to not provoke men and tempt them to sin. Now, we don't think like that. We think that our women are capable of equal moral dignity to men, and even though we have the ambiguous complementarity of gender differences, and it can be a source of playfulness and frustration between the sexes at times, and this is why the boomers themselves always have jokes about husbands and wives hating each other, but really loving each other. We don't think like the Islamic world do. We think that our women and girls are capable of equal moral dignity, and because of size and strength differentials between men and women, actually deserving of extra protection by good men who need to cultivate their strength to defend their family, their loved ones, and their civilization. We have a completely inverted way of thinking about things as the Islamic world, but Toombs doesn't understand that, and Toombs is still saying that a girl in a hijab reciting Kipling brings a tear to his eye. If only we could get more of this happening. The other problem with the Michaela School model is that in order to accommodate that, especially if applied at the level of the state, as the likes of Fraser Nelson, Kemi Badenoch, Katherine Birbalsingh herself might want, is that it requires the liquidation of the host majority identity to become leveled down to an equal playing field with the tribal, ethno-religious minorities imported into the country that are rote learning how to be British or English. And one, people don't want this. It's very patronizing. I do not like any attempts to redefine my identity that comes naturally to me, because it sort of forces me to rationally justify it or abandon any pretense to exclusively own it. And especially if this comes from someone of immigrant heritage, it is very condescending. It's almost the inverse of the kind of thing that Konstantin Kisin has talked about before. I went back and forth with Konstantin on X about this phenomenon a little while ago, and Konstantin remains a friend, so we just disagree in good spirits here. But he said that a kind of realpolitik point, he thought that politicians like Kemi Badenoch are best suited to make the case for defending British identity because she has regime-approved diversity body armor as an immigrant, as a black woman, and so often it will take immigrants to show the British the way, because we have become so deracinated and distanced from our culture that it almost takes an outsider to come in and tell us what we're about and save us. And I think people derive a sense of flattery from that when it happens. This is why people like Konstantin defending British identity and British culture so much, because it's nice to see someone who came over as an immigrant as a child be so grateful for this country having taken him in, and to lavish praise upon it. But for then the convert to be given access to the pulpit to then redefine what Britishness is, rather than defer to it, rather than learn what it is and praise it, to then expand the definition to encompass themselves and put themselves on an equal playing field with those who have inherited the identity, those to whom the identity comes most naturally. One, it's not just a falsehood that jars with people, because it's just a category error. Like you're not English if your parents are not English. That's just a falsehood, not a moral judgment, but it's just a fact. But it's also, it feels like someone's trying to get one over on you by redefining your identity to encompass them, even if it is well-meaning because they actually quite like your identity. And so the third issue with this, again, is it desirable to want a Michaela School? Is it desirable to want to live under a surveillance regime that enforces silence in corridors, that enforces vegetarianism on all people because Hindus don't eat beef and Muslims don't eat, and Jews don't eat pork, and some religions are wholly vegetarian, so everyone just has to eat plant food as to not offend anyone? Is it desirable to completely compartmentalize our competing conceptions of the good and subordinate the one which has acted as the powerful substrate for all of the laws, customs, traditions that we hold dear and think are excellent, and to shove them away in the drawer, presuming as well that all other religions will do the same. And if they don't do it, then it requires the constant monitoring and arbitration by a state that's acting as a headmistress to make the host majority and imported tribal minorities play nice at all times. Is this a desirable state of affairs? Is it a sustainable state of affairs? I mean, this is the third proper reason why people objected so much to what Toome said. The hour is way too late and the threat way too large for these insufficient suggestions, these patently false renditions of national identity and integration strategies to be suggested. When David Betts and Dominic Cummings are warning of the imminent likelihood of civil war within the next 5 years, based on a comprehensive reading of the literature on urban warfare, based on security briefings in number 10 Downing Street, and they're saying, look, it doesn't matter whether or not you as an ethnic minority believe in British values, because these life or death interactions in a urban skirmish environment are not going to go on long enough to interrogate you as to how many Keats quotes you can throw out. Instead, the people are just going to take a look at you, see that you don't look like them, and make a snap judgment. And so that means that actually, the immigrants and minorities that have been accepted into the tribe and maybe even married a British person might fall on the wrong side of that tribal judgment, something that none of us want, by the way. If they're making all those warnings, then stop yammering about the Michaela School. Stop blabbering about how sentimental and misty-eyed you get because some girl in hijab can quote Kipling. I mean, it is not good enough. Things are really, really dire, and we are building towards a situation of unrecoverable violence along ethnic lines, not along Islam and British values, as David Betts told Andrew Gold recently, but people making snap judgments on complexion alone. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is actually because despite what I am judged as being by the likes of Anaya Falar and Aman in slanderous spike pieces, I have a very individualistic, congenial liberal temperament when it comes to getting along with people. I grew up going to school and living next to African families. One of my parish priests is a chap, I think he's from Zimbabwe. I've always thought that West Africans in particular have quite a warm, West African Christians have quite a warm disposition. I seem to have gotten along with them. So I don't make snap judgments along racial lines. You can make predictable judgments about people from certain nationalities and how they would behave. For example, I neither does Ayaan Hirsi Ali, by the way. I don't expect much in terms of philosophical or scientific innovation from the Somali expat community in Britain, given 72% of them are living in social housing. I think it's a pretty predictable pattern that Pakistanis will have barbaric views of our women and girls. I think it's fair to think that Albanians are pretty likely to become drug dealers and gang members, and so we should just deter all of the foreign nationals and not let any more in. However, I would quite like a civilization where the admittedly vanishingly small, but still some members of other countries who do have a real affinity for our culture, customs, and heritage, and who fall in love with a member of our tribe, can get married and can join the tribe, and whose descendants become an actually assimilated, indistinguishable constituent of our isles, who feels grateful to live here and who comes to call this place their own. It would be really nice to have that, but that is a luxury that one has only when they understand that we exist as a distinct people in whose interests our state, our politicians, our culture should act. And without that distinct people, without that distinct culture, without that distinct state, what are outsiders meant to be assimilating into? What are they joining? They're just instead becoming one among many cogs in a well-oiled market, or another grey goo integer stumbling around the landmass of the British Isles, signing up to modish British values which don't actually mean anything. like tolerance and the rule of law. Basically, you're swearing fealty to a state that manages you sufficiently. So I think the Michaela School vision of the country is dystopic, and it is an unhealthy addiction that many of our politicians and conservative intelligentsia have hooked themselves up to.